Yes, you do. So save your questions for the fall virtual retreat that we're going to do.
Or emails. I don't necessarily answer emails, but you can email me, and I may, especially if I know who you are, I'm more likely to respond.
This book to Dame to be addressed.
Yes, yeah, that's probably a better way, yeah. Send all hate mail and disagreements to Father Andrew Stephen Damick at Ancient Faith Ministries.
I've almost done that so many times. Thought he may not appreciate it. All right, we are going to go right into our Bible study. Who wants to guess, without looking at the Amen YouTube channel, what number Bible study this is officially that we've done? Just throw out a number.
31.
Close. Anybody else? 31 was the first
I
one.
don't even know.
You don't even know?
I don't know.
Well, I know you don't watch them. You told me that.
Yeah, I don't watch myself talk. That would be horrifying. Especially since, like, I have my camera, like, my face fills the screen. So you can imagine me using YouTube on my Roku on, like, a 58-inch TV, just my own giant head talking. Like, it's nightmarish.
So any other guesses? There was 31. Anybody else want to guess?
33.
Closer.
30 and a half.
34. We have 33 done, so this will be number 34. Okay, does anybody want to let me use their Wi-Fi hotspot on their phone, because I need to get the Zoom going, and I don't have an internet connection. Can I?
I have a parishioner's room number. We can see if they paid for Wi-Fi.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to log into the Hilton.
They ask you for a name and a room number when you try to connect to their Wi-Fi.
Do they?
Yeah, I tried.
Yeah, sure. Do you have a hotspot?
I don't have a hotspot, but I guess.
I've got one.
Yeah. What's it called?
It's not as hot. I was saying you could just click on the Hilton one and put my name and.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, you could do that too.
Name and number,
Yeah,
my name.
room number.
Okay, 1 second, guys, while I connect here.
Which may be more stable than
Yeah.
the phone hotspot.
Well, we're gonna try this and see. It looks like I'm connected.
To the Hilton thing?
No, to
Oh.
Philip came through.
Do you have 5G?
I've got unlimited 5G.
Oh.
This is the real G.
High roller over here.
Yeah, fancy
Okay, guys,
land.
we're about to start. We are live streaming on the Antiochian Men YouTube channel. So
Already? They've been
Yes.
watching this? Oh,
Well, just started.
okay.
And we are now live in Zoom. Already have a couple of people logged in.
One of them is not a man, transgressive. Oh, no, they changed their name. They changed their name. So is it actually someone else? Or is this like in Life of Brian when they were selling the fake beards to the women so they could attend the stoning?
We got people waving at you here.
Okay.
All right. We are live on the Antiochian Men YouTube channel and in Zoom for this in-person Bible study, the 34th edition. So just before we start, a shameless plug. If you want to see the first 33 Bible studies, they're all an hour and a half long, some a little bit longer with Q&A. They're all on the Antiochian Men YouTube channel, so you can get up to speed if you would like to. That's a lot of content.
That's kind of false advertising.
Why is that?
Technically, they're each an hour and a half
Oh,
long.
I'm sorry. Each an hour and a half.
All an hour and a half long would be you could watch all of them in an hour and a half.
That would be disappointing.
Yes, that would.
Thank you for correcting that.
I was hopeful there for a minute.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Father Stephen, again for doing these Bible studies. You're good to go.
Okay. Yeah, I'm waiting for this to open up. This is the problem with technology.
Your Orthodox Study Bible is digital, correct?
That's the one I'm using today, at least. Yeah, so that's why I'm going to have all kinds of problems. Okay. When we get started here in just a moment, we're going to pick up at the beginning of Genesis chapter 21. We did chapter 20 last time. Sorry to folks who weren't aware this existed or who haven't been watching it. Now all of a sudden we're just dropping randomly into an episode of the life of Abraham, who are here in person. Yeah, that's where we left off. By way of sort of quick review, in chapter 20, in the last Bible study, we saw the interactions between Abraham and Abimelech, and the first one of those interactions was especially bad because Abraham essentially repeated kind of the worst thing we had seen him do so far. Very early on in the story of Abraham, when he had first arrived in Canaan after coming from Ur with his household and extended family, he had needed to take shelter from a famine in Egypt, and he was worried that when they saw his wife Sarah, that some man would want to take her for his wife, even though she was 80 at the time, and would kill him. And so he lied and said she was his sister, and so lo and behold, Pharaoh decided to add her to his harem, said she was unattached, and then horrible things started happening to Egypt because of it, because of the injustice that Pharaoh was about to commit with another man's wife. And so Abraham was sort of chided at that point. This was sort of the worst thing, as I said, that he had done, in that he had failed to trust God, right? He had sort of trusted God enough to move across.
Recording in progress.
Sorry. To move across the known world, and to do these other things, but now when sort of the chips were down, he had concocted this sort of ruse, right, that had had these sort of disastrous results, and he had failed to protect his wife, right? And so God had to protect his wife for him, right, because of his failure. And so we'd had a number of other stories in Abraham's life, and then, as I mentioned, we come to Abimelech in chapter 20, the last chapter we read, where Abraham had to sort of pick up camp and move, because, of course, he had not just this extended family, but he had flocks and herds and animals. You can't just have flocks and herds and animals grazing on the same land forever, right, because you wreck it. So he had to move every so often, and he moved into an area that was ruled by Abimelech, who was the king of the Gerarites. And he gets worried that someone is going to see her and decide that he wants her for a wife and will kill Abraham. And so Abraham does the same thing again, the exact same thing. And we talked about last time how a lot of sort of biblical scholars and stuff will say, oh, well, look, this is basically the same story, so this must have come from two different sources, ancient sources, and they compiled and they shoved them together, and, you know, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And that kind of misses the point that, as we talked about last time, I don't know about you, but when I go to confession, I tend to say the same things over and over again, right? Even though I know it's wrong, and I know it's stupid, and I know it's destructive, and I've faced bad consequences from stuff I've done, I tend to do it again, right? And so the fact that Abraham did that, right, in this way, had the same failing, the same failure to protect his wife, the same failure of trying to protect himself instead and doing it by his own devices instead of trusting God, right? This is actually very realistic, right? This is something we can all observe happening in our lives. And so that was resolved again in basically the same way, right, where bad things started happening. And Abimelech came and confronted Abraham and said, why did you do this horrible thing? Right? He addresses it as if he's done a horrible thing to Abimelech by lying to him, right, and almost bringing this, you know, the consequences of this injustice on him. But then once that was resolved, Abraham and Abimelech made a pact so that Abraham could dwell on his land and graze his flocks and herds. And so that's basically where we left off at the end of the last Bible study. So unless anybody has any comments or questions, or some fascinating news alert just popped up on your phone that we have to all know about, we'll go ahead and get started in Genesis chapter 21, verse 1. Now the Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. Okay, so this is referring directly back to not just the promise to Abraham that he was going to have a son, but also remember that promise was made to Sarah, and she famously sort of laughed while she was off cooking, because of course, yes, my 100-year-old husband and I, a 90-year-old woman, are going to have a baby. Sure thing, right? But God, of course, had promised this. And so we're being called back to that. This is now exactly what happens. And notice that it happens at the time of God's choosing. What is that referring us back to? Well, we're going to see as this chapter goes on, this is referring us back to the whole episode with Hagar. Remember, who was an enslaved woman who served Sarah, who, because God had made this promise that Abraham would have a son, and they're looking and going, this seems unlikely. Abraham tried to take matters into his own hands by conceiving a son with Hagar, who was a younger woman. She bore him a son, Ishmael, right? So this is a pointed comment about it happening at the time of God's choosing, not when Abraham made it happen, right? And again, remember the story was with Pharaoh and Abimelech, right? Abraham tends to try to take things into his own hands and his own ingenuity and figure things out. Verse 3, so Abraham called the name of his son born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. Right? So we're off to a good start. Right? Abraham receives a son. He does what God commanded him, circumcises him back when God told Abraham to circumcise himself. In a previous Bible study, we talked a lot about circumcision. I won't go into all that again now. But Abraham is doing what he's supposed to do. He's honoring, so far, his responsibilities as a father, at least. As a husband, he's been a little dicey, but as a father, he's now taking the matter in hand. Now, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh. All who hear will laugh with me. Right? So, Isaac means laughter. Right? So that's kind of a pun on the fact that she laughed when she heard about it. And she's doing sort of a further wordplay here. God has made me laugh, not like, haha, funny joke, but God has made me laugh as in like rejoice. Right? And brought joy to me. And everybody who hears about this, that God has brought a son to a 90-year-old barren woman, right? They're also going to laugh with me, right? At this great thing that God has done. Verse 7, she also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne a child in my old age. Right, so she's rejoicing and exulting in this. Everything seems good. Things are about to not be as good. Verse 8, so the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day Isaac was weaned. Right, so this is pre-bar mitzvahs, right? This is a cultural tradition that Abraham likely brought with him from Ur, of having a celebration at the day that a child was weaned. That's not really adulthood. They did nurse longer than we usually do in modern times. I won't go into all the ins and outs of that, but not that long, not till 13, right? So, but they did throw this celebration. Why would they do that? Well, unfortunately, in the ancient world, we're now around the 1900s BC, the 20th century BC. The infant mortality rate was tremendous, right? So when a child lived to the point of being weaned, to the point of being able to eat solid food, that was a cause for celebration, right? That was a point to have this kind of feast. Verse 9, now Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, who was born to Abraham, playing with Isaac her son. Okay, so the kids are getting along, but remember what happened right after Ishmael was born, right? Sarah tried to get rid of Hagar, right, out of jealousy, out of bitterness. So this is not just, oh, look, they're playing together. Isn't that nice, right? This saw is closer to the evil eye, right? This is the hairy eyeball, right? Oh yeah, he's still around here. Verse 10, therefore she said to Abraham, cast out this maidservant and her son, for the son of this maidservant shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Okay. So what's she concerned about? Technically, Ishmael is Abraham's oldest son. Therefore, technically, as his firstborn son, Ishmael inherits everything. Right? That's how inheritance worked in the ancient world. So the firstborn son inherited everything and had sort of a cultural and social responsibility to then distribute that inheritance to the other heirs. Right? Some of them took that cultural and social responsibility more or less seriously, right? So we find, for example, even in the New Testament, the man who comes to Jesus and says, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me, right? So his older brother was just keeping it all, right? And Christ responds and tells him, hey, don't worry about treasures on earth, right? Come follow me. Let your brother have the inheritance if he wants it. But so that was still the way it worked. And I won't go too far into this as an aside, but this is also important when we read what St. Paul is doing in Romans, when he talks about us being co-heirs with Christ, right? The idea is that Christ is the firstborn, he inherits everything, right? And then he distributes his inheritance with his brethren. That language gets used a lot in the New Testament. If you don't understand that social structure, you'll misinterpret it in weird ways. So Sarah is concerned, right, that, well, Ishmael has a really good claim, not just to a piece of the inheritance, but he has a claim to all of it, right? And not only would that make Ishmael the inheritor, but in the ancient world, just like today, women live longer than men for the most part. And so that would mean that Hagar would become sort of the matriarch of this big extended family and all of this wealth when her son inherited, meaning not Sarah, right? And so this isn't just a simple matter of jealousy, like I think he might love that son more or something. We tend to psychologize these things. This was a very practical, pragmatic thing about inheritance rights and money and her well-being and what the rest of her life was going to look like when Abraham was gone. And he's 100, so like he's not going to live forever, right? At least not in this world. She says, hey, you need to get rid of them. They need to be out of the picture. Needs to be clear-cut. Isaac is the heir. He inherits everything. I'm the matriarch of the family. You're gone, right? So he could take care of me. Verse 11, and the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. Which son? Ishmael. Right? Ishmael. So Abraham is presented here as loving Ishmael and Isaac, right? And that's why he's troubled, because he's like, well, if Sarah wants me to just get rid of them, he does not want to get rid of them. So he's torn. What do I do, right? Verse 12, but God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of your son and your maidservant. Whatever Sarah said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a great nation of the son of your maidservant, because he is your seed. Okay. So God says to Abraham, right, just go ahead and do what Sarah wants you to do. And yes, Isaac is going to be considered your firstborn. And this is the beginning of a pattern that we're going to see throughout the rest of Genesis, where even though it's supposed to be the firstborn son who inherits everything, it's never going to be the firstborn son who inherits everything, right? So it's going to be Isaac rather than Ishmael. It's going to be Jacob rather than Esau, right? And then you look at the sons of Jacob, right? And Reuben, Simeon, right? Nothing, right? Judah, the third born, kingship, right? Levi, fourth, priesthood, right? It's way down the list. And even Joseph's sons, as Joseph has two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and when Jacob goes to bless them, he crosses his hands and gives the firstborn blessing to the younger one. So this is a pattern that's already getting established here. And this is part of what St. Paul is talking about when he talks about God choosing the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, but the wisdom of God being foolishness to the world. Right? That God sort of isn't bound by these things. So we could take someone like St. Paul who's persecuting the church, or someone like St. Peter who's a probably illiterate fisherman, right? and make them, right, the leaders of his church. But so he says, yes, it is going to be Isaac through whom, right, your seed is going to be reckoned. Remember, we talked about when the promises were first made to Abraham, there was both seed used in sort of the plural sense of, yeah, you're going to have a ton of descendants. There was also seed used in a singular sense, that there was going to be one particular seed who was going to come from Abraham. And St. Paul picks up on this in Galatians and says that seed, that singular seed that was promised to Abraham, is Christ, who is descended from Abraham. Right? And so when it says your seed is going to be reckoned through Isaac or Jacob or any of these, it's not saying this is the one I like better from God, right? Or this is the one who's saved. That language isn't even in Genesis, but this is the one who's saved, and this other one I don't care about. This other one's, going to hell. It's this is the one who's in the line that's going to produce the seed, capital S, the Messiah, the Christ, way down the line, right? Because, and that's not just in light of the New Testament, because he goes on to say, this other son of yours, the reason why it's okay for you to go ahead and send them away is I'm also going to do something for him, right? I'm also going to make him a great nation. Right? I'm also going, the same things I'm going to do for Isaac, I'm also going to do for Ishmael. The difference is Isaac is the one from whom the seed, the Messiah, is going to come. But otherwise, right? And why? Because they're both sons of Abraham. So the broad descendants, seed plural, goes to all of his descendants. And then there's also this singular firstborn seed that follows one genealogy. Verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness near the well of oath. This is where Abimelech and Abraham had taken an oath, right? So he gives them water, gives them some stuff, sends them out. Verse 15, when the water in the skin was used up, she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. So this is this very human moment. They're out of water. They're out in the desert. She knows her baby's going to die. Her child's going to die. It's not a baby anymore, but her child is going to die before she does. And so she can't bear to watch her own child die before she does. So she sets him down in the shade and goes away, and then she just weeps and cries out. Verse 17, but God heard the voice of the lad from the place where he was. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not fear, For God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. I like lad. We're following the New King James. Young lad. But notice something has shifted here, right? You might have expected, if you knew that God heard cries, that it would have been hers. She sits there and weeps. But it says his. It's talking about Ishmael's. It's talking about the boys. Why is that important? Well, because again, if we read Genesis closely, it's clarifying for us. It's not that God has the kind of relationship with Isaac that he had with Abraham, and he doesn't have that kind of relationship with Ishmael. It's being reinforced to us here. No, he has that kind of relationship with Ishmael also. Right? With Ishmael also. And God says, right, to Hagar, don't be afraid, right? I've heard your son's voice, and, right, and so you don't have to be afraid. Verse 18, arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water, and gave the lad a drink. Thus God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the desert and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So, again, the reason that God told Abraham, oh, do what Sarah wants, is not because God, agreed with Sarah over against Hagar. Right? It was that God had a plan for Hagar and Ishmael. And said, okay, give Sarah what she wants. I'll take care of them. Right? Because they weren't going to be taken care of with Sarah, right, in the camp, clearly. This is the second attempt, right, to get rid of them. But, yes, sir.
Angel, is that a hypostasis of Yahweh, or is that?
Yeah, so in the Hebrew, this is the angel of Yahweh. So, yes, this is potentially. Now, interestingly, in this case, usually the angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, appears to people. In this case, it's a little different because she hears the voice of the angel of Yahweh from heaven. Right? So I would say this is the same person as the angel of Yahweh in the other places where the angel of Yahweh appears. Right? And there's a definite article. Right? So this is a figure. And if you've listened to previous Bible studies, you know we've talked about how this is the second person of the Holy Trinity. Right? That this is Christ. That angel should not be. We tend to interpret angel woodenly, literally, as being this sort of species of spiritual being, right? But word angel also just means messenger or representative, right? And so this is a particular one. The story is very important because it's one of many, many places where if we read the Torah carefully, we should understand that the role of Israel and Judah later is very different from the one as it's talked about, unfortunately, not just by some of our Protestant friends, but also politically. None of this is directed toward an ethnic group of people, number one. And none of this is talking about what we would call salvation. None of this is talking about relationship with God, knowledge of God, being restricted to people of one ethnic group. This is one of several places that make that clear. Right? From God's perspective, the relationship of God to the person Ishmael and to the person Isaac is presented here as not different. Okay? I'm going to go a step farther now, okay? Because this is not just true of the people, the historical individuals. This is true of the nations descended from them in the rest of the Torah. because we talked about how Abraham got promised this huge stretch of land, right? Which all of our dispensationalist friends will inform you was never all belonging to Israel, right? And we can all nod our head and agree and say yes, because God never promised it all to Israel. He promised it all to Abraham, right? And that was promised not as an end in itself, but as we talked about, that land that they had in ancient times was the sign of the bigger promise. The promise of Abraham's descendants becoming sons of God. The promise of them inheriting, right, paradise as co-heirs of that singular seed, right? All of that was the long-term promise, right? But in terms of in the flesh, none of the readers of the Torah, right, originally saw that happen, saw Christ's birth, right? Saw any of those things come to pass that St. Paul is going to say came to pass in Christ. But they didn't see that. But what they did see, the generation that survived the wilderness at least, what they did see was God bringing them into a piece of land and giving it to them. And so frequently in prophecy in the scriptures, there's some immediate sign, and then that's the proof of the greater thing, right, that is going to come in the future. So that you can know for sure, because we saw this. Therefore we know that will also come to pass. When we get into Deuteronomy 2, though, what we find is Israel, having been brought with Moses out of Egypt, brought through the wilderness, is getting ready at the beginning of Deuteronomy to come into Canaan. And in Deuteronomy chapter 2, they come to Edom, so Esau's descendants. And Esau's descendants are there, and God says to Israel, you're not to take 1 foot, it literally says the length of 1 foot, right, of land from the Edomites. It doesn't belong to you. And the reason God says it doesn't belong to the Israelites is he says, because I brought the Edomites here, I led them in battle to wipe out the giant clans that were here, and I gave them this land around Mount Seir. It's theirs. And then he says the same thing about the Moabites and the Ammonites, who are descended from Lot's sons, who we saw earlier, right? So that big piece of land that was promised to Abraham goes to Abraham's descendants, only one of which was Israel, right? And they're late to the party. When they get there, everyone else, God has already led into the land and given them their land, right? and given it to them, and then Israel sort of shows up last to take theirs, and then kind of fails to do it. The contrast in Joshua is that, hey, Edom seems to have taken the whole piece of land that God gave them, and Moab took the whole piece of land. But when you see a bunch of the tribes sort of go, they have a lot of chariots, I don't know, we'll just settle here, right? And they don't go take the land they got. So Israel's actually presented as kind of a bad example compared to the rest of Abraham's descendants, right? But with Ishmael, it's even more interesting maybe, because the Midianites were Ishmaelites. So when we get to Exodus, right, and Moses, as far as we could tell, doesn't really know who Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob really is, right, growing up in Pharaoh's court, kills an Egyptian, runs off into the desert. Who does he run into? Jethro, the Midianite priest, who worships Yahweh. He's a Midianite. He's a descendant of Ishmael. They're still worshiping the God of Abraham out there. And it's through him, he becomes his father-in-law, because Moses marries Zipporah, his daughter. It's through him, going and tending his sheep and coming to the mountain of God and seeing the burning bush. It's through him that he comes to know, through Ishmaelites, that he comes to know who Yahweh, the God of Israel, is. Right? That's how he comes to know, through the Ishmaelites. And this is not only there in Exodus, we actually have archaeology on this, interestingly. The first place where the name Yahweh for a God appears are two Egyptian inscriptions. One of them from around the 15th century and one of them from around the 12th century that refer to Yahoo, who is the god of the Shasu Bedouins. Guess who the Egyptians called the Shasu Bedouins? The Midianites, the Ishmaelites. That was their name for them. So before Israel comes into being, from the perspective of the Egyptians, Yahweh was not Yahweh the God of Israel, he was Yahweh the God of the Ishmaelites. Before that. So this isn't just, oh, this guy Ishmael, he didn't do anything wrong. So he still had this relationship with God. This is descendants for generations. Right? Descendants for generations. And St. Paul's going to work with this in Romans 9, because St. Paul, when he talks about Jacob and Esau, he gives these two quotes that for some reason a lot of our friends don't look up and don't look at the context. One of them is actually about Jacob and Esau, the people from Genesis. Right? It said the older shall serve the younger. And then the second one is the famous Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated, which is from one of the prophets, talking about the destruction of Edom, centuries and centuries later, the nation of Edom. Right? So one is the beginning of Edom's story, and one of them is the end. And what St. Paul points out is, as long as the older served the younger, as long as Edom remained in relationship with Israel and her God, everything was good. When they turned their back on Israel's God, that was it. Right? That was it. They were done. Right? And St. Paul takes that and he applies that, even though they were the descendants of Abraham, who had received all these things from God. Then it was done. And then St. Paul in Romans 9 applies that to, why are there all of these Jewish people who haven't accepted Jesus as the Messiah? And St. Paul says, well, right, if you don't keep faith with the Messiah, if you don't keep faith with the firstborn, the heir, the seed, right, then it doesn't matter how blessed you've been in the past, it doesn't matter who you're descended from, that's it. Just like for the Edomites then, the Jewish people who did not accept Christ, that becomes the end of their story, right, with God, because they rejected him in Christ. So it's not that St. Paul comes along and says, oh, hey, it's not about ethnicity anymore. God doesn't like one ethnicity better than any others anymore. It was never that way. And that's actually what St. Paul is arguing most of the time, is that it was never that way. Because he's read Genesis, right? And is trying to explain that. Right? And is trying to explain that. And this is one of the places where we see it. Right? So there is a distinction between Isaac and Ishmael, but that distinction is whose descendant is the Messiah going to be. And other than that, God treats both of them the same. Right? And they both are co-inheritors. They're both co-heirs, right? And so there's a certain irony even in that telling of the story, because what did Sarah not want? I don't want him to be a co-heir with my son. Right? Well, maybe he wasn't of the material goods that Abraham's family had, but he was of the promises, which are a whole lot more important. Right? Okay. So, verse 22. Now it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and his friend Okozat, I don't know that he's a saint, or I'd recommend naming some kids Okozat. Be the only one at school. You wouldn't be like Okozat B and Okozat D or something. Like, and Phicol, another great one, the commander-in-chief of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all you do. Now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the righteousness I did to you, you will do to me, and to the land in which you have dwelt. Okay? So Abimelech, who Abraham had kind of wronged originally, but he and his top guys, right? He's a king, so his top officials are seeing how Abraham's living, right? And they're seeing that, hey, this guy's kind of like a nomad. He has no fixed address, but he's doing well, right? He's not the king of a city, but he's doing well. He's prospering, right? And this amazing thing, by the way, just happened where he's 100 years old and his wife is 90 and they had a baby, right? This guy is clearly favored by his God, right? We don't want to read too much into his references to God, right? But he's favored by his God, right? He's doing something right, right? And so we need to form, right, a pact, right? We don't want to get on the wrong side of this, right? We don't want to get on the wrong side of this. This is interesting because this is the first instance in the Bible of sort of lifestyle evangelism, right? Where Abraham is just sort of living in the midst of these other peoples and letting them see how he lives in the world, how he relates to it, how he conducts himself. And that is, just by virtue of that, they're being directed to his God, right? And coming to, in some tangential sense at least, be connected to his God. Verse 24, so Abraham said, I swear. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because a well of water Abimelech's servants had seized. Okay? So he says, sure, but hey, some of your guys blocked up this well that my herds and herdsmen were using, right? And they're, as we saw with the story with Hagar, they're pretty close to the desert, so water source is very important. Verse 26, Abimelech replied, I do not know who did this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. So he's first time hearing of this, right? So I haven't been deliberately letting this happen to you. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. So you're like, wait, so why is he giving him stuff, right? So this isn't him just like, hey, here's some gifts, livestock, right, to Abimelech. These are what's being used to make the covenant. Remember, we saw the covenant that God made with Abraham, where he had Abraham go and split the animals in half and lay them on either side, right? And then he had to sort of ward off the vultures and buzzards while he was waiting for God to finish, we were told. But then what happened was God's presence appears in the form of this flaming torch, and he walked between the halves. And we talked about how this was a ritual for cutting a covenant. That's why they called it cutting a covenant. For making this agreement where you're essentially swearing an oath that if I violate this, may I end up like these animals. Right? And so we talked about how the interesting thing with the covenant God made with Abraham is God didn't make Abraham walk between the animals. He didn't make Abraham swear if he violated his covenant with God that he would be killed and cut in half, but God walked between them. So God took the oath in that case. But so that's why he has the animals, is that they're cutting these animals in half. I'm glad this isn't how we do contracts anymore. I'd much rather sign my name than have to hack a bull into two pieces. But this is what it's describing them doing, and then them both walking between it. So this is a fairly serious oath that they're taking. Verse 28, then Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Thus Abimelech asked Abraham, why have you placed these 7 ewe lambs by themselves? Verse 30, he replied, you must take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand to witness that I dug this well. Right? So he says, right, this is going to be, I want to help you remember, right, that this is my well. Right? Because you said you didn't know anything about it, you weren't aware what was going on. This will help you remember here. Right? Here's this gift. Therefore he called that place the Well of Oath, because the two of them swore an oath there. Thus they made a covenant at the Well of Oath. So Abimelech rose with Okozat his friend, and Phicol, the commander-in-chief of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. So we talked about how that's a little bit, the last time they referred to that last chapter, it's a little bit anachronistic. This is one of those places where the text of Genesis looks like it's been later updated by an editorial hand, because of course the Philistines weren't there yet. But whatever the original name was that was there, it was a name that no one would have recognized later because the Philistines wiped out whatever it was, right? And built their own cities, right? So it's been updated to say, over there, Philistia. Then Abraham planted a field at the well of Oath, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the eternal God. So Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. Okay. So we talked about how calling on the name of the Lord, this is a phrase that refers to worship, right? So this isn't just he yelled something, right? Or even that he just prayed out loud. There's an altar that he's offering sacrifice, right? So this became the place where, while he was staying in that land, this was the place where Abraham worshipped. And I think I've mentioned before, but I think it's been a while, so I'll mention it again here, that if you track through the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there are 12 places where they build altars, this being one of them. And if you then do the mapping of the land given to the 12 tribes of Israel, there's one in the land of each tribe. So if they had all settled in the land that God had given them, if they'd all gone to the places they were supposed to go and settled where they were supposed to settle, each one of them would have had this shrine from Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, right, within their territory. This being one of them. So we've still got a little bit, right? We're going till 4:30?
Yeah, we got it.
Yeah, okay. We're going to go for it then. Chapter 22. If you flip over to it, you'll see why I say go for it. So verse 1, now it came to pass after these things. We don't know how long after these things, right? So the last chapter ends with, he stayed there for a long time, and now we get, now after these things. This is, my grandpa used to do that. He'd say, the other day, and the other day could have been yesterday, or the other day could have been 20 years ago, right? Like the other day. So some time has passed, right? Isaac is older. Came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Okay. So I'm going to start just right here about the word tested, right? Because everybody here, or most everybody here, probably knows the story that's about to happen. So I can go ahead and start talking about this here. So we have, when we hear the words, and in a lot of cases it's the same word translated two different ways, tested or tempted, in Scripture, we have a certain idea, right? So we tend to think, especially with tempted, that it's being tempted to sin, right? There's some evil thing you're not supposed to do, and someone comes and entices you, right, to do it. That's how we read temptation. And if you read this that way, it's going to be really confusing because, of course, we're going to be told God tempts no man, right, in the New Testament, right? But so, or if we read tested and we think about it like a test that we take, right, at school, where the idea is the instructor doesn't know what we know, and so the instructor gives us a test so the instructor can assess what we know, like get some information that he doesn't already have about us, right? That also doesn't make a lot of sense when we're talking about God, right? Like God doesn't have to put on an elaborate ruse to figure out whether Abraham really loves him or something, right? Like God knows exactly who Abraham is. He knows exactly every thought and feeling and everything that Abraham has, right? He doesn't need to test him in that way, right? But there's another use for the word test that this is really getting at that we don't use as much because most of us don't do a ton of blacksmithing, right? I know a few people who have done some blacksmithing, right? But where testing or trying is about tempering and purifying like a metal, right? Like trial by fire, right? So you take a piece of metal, you shove it into super high heat, right? All the impurities get burned away. All the dross, all the garbage get burned away. And you're left with pure metal, right? And then once you've forged a blade or something, you have to temper it, you have to strengthen it, right? You also do that with fire. Right? So the scriptures we use that language to talk about humans going through that kind of experience where we're tried, right? And we're tested. Meaning we go through some kind of experience in this life that sort of burns away, and this is an unpleasant experience being shoved into a fire, right? The metal can't yell and scream, right? But we can. Passing through a fire is a very painful experience, right? But these experiences sort of burn away sort of the garbage from us, right? The dross, the impurities, right? And leave behind. So we even see in the prophets often it will say that Israel is going to be, Israel or Judah is going to be tested and refined like precious gold, right? Because if you've got gold and you want to purify it, what do? Heat it up and melt it, right? And burn away everything else, and what's left is pure. Okay? So right here the framing is this experience that Abraham is about to have is going to be an experience that's going to be purifying and refining for him. Right? So it very much is God's about to put him through something. Right? God's going to put him through something. But he's going to come out of the other side of this experience different. Right? More solid, more pure. Right? And so it is a trial, right, that is for his good, not a trial like a court trial. Right? Where it's see what he does. And this is very important in terms of how we interpret this. Because even very smart people like Soren Kierkegaard, right, have read this and treat this story as if it's this moral dilemma, right? God comes to you. Bob Dylan even did this. God comes to you and says, "Kill your son." Right? Do you do it or not? Right? And it's described in this moral dilemma, right? Or as if God doesn't know what he's going to choose to do. As if God wasn't planning, right, to not actually have him kill his son. I just want to see if you can go through with it, man, right? Like, that's not, right, at all in view here, right? So this is for Abraham's sake, right? This is for Abraham's sake. We've seen Abraham is very close to God. God appears with him, sits and eats with him. They have this close relationship, but we've also seen that Abraham is far from perfect. Especially when it comes to his family life, his responsibilities to his wife, dealing with these things with his children, right? And so God isn't in the business of saying, well, Abraham's close enough, right? He's better than most people, right? You know, he makes the bar, he makes the cut, we'll take him to heaven, right? God's in the business now of purifying. Right? He's not just saying, hey, when you die, I'll make you like one of the stars of heaven. God is making Abraham like one of the stars of heaven. Right? He's making him more like himself, more like God. Right? He's refining and purifying, bringing him to maturity, bringing him to completion as the person he created him to be. That's not always a pleasant process. Right? And so that's sort of the background in which the story now is going to unfold. So verse 2, then he said, "Take now your beloved son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a whole burnt offering on one of the mountains I tell you." So, pretty clear instructions, right? Not a lot of ambiguities for Abraham to hang his hat on, right? No technicalities to pull, right? Take him, offer him his whole burnt. I'll take him to this land. I'll show you the mountain. Go up there, offer him his whole burnt offering. Just as a side note, I do have to bring this up because I'm in this weird space where this is a question I get asked a lot. So, in human sacrificial rituals, The ancient world, I won't get too graphic about this, but they tended to involve cannibalism of one sort or another, right? There's none of that in view here because notice, whole burnt offering. Whole thing, right? So it's just, you're going to take him, you're going to kill him, you're going to burn him up completely, right? That's what's in view. Offering him back to God. Verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split firewood for the whole burnt offering and arose and went to the place God told him. So this is the Abraham we saw back in Genesis 12, at the beginning of his story, where God comes to him and says, hey, I want you to pick up stakes, head to the other side of the known world. And Abraham does it, right? So we got the same thing here. We don't see Abraham walking around in a moral quandary. No, it is wrong to kill another human being. Yet, God has told me this. Did God really? Right? The kind of, which, I'm picking on Soren Kierkegaard actually a little bit here. But we don't see that here. Abraham just says, God told me to do it, so I'm doing it. Verse 4, then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. Thus Abraham said to his young men, comment on that in a second, stay here with the donkey, the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. So Isaac's still a lad. The young men, I don't want to spoil in the book, the God has made a war book when we get to Elisha and the she-bears. But there's a word that tends to get translated youths or children or young men in the, I go into more detail on it in there, in the Old Testament that kind of can mean that, but it's usually meant to use like young officials or young army officers is what it usually means. So that's what's here. It's not that like Abraham just travels with a bunch of teenagers or something, right? Everywhere he goes. These are his guys, right? These are his, probably some of his herdsmen and stuff who are accompanying him for protection, exactly, on this trip, because he's a 100-year-old man, right, out there with a kid. Right. So, but so then Abraham said to his young men, he tells them to stay there, and we're going to go yonder. Why? Well, because obviously these guys would have tried to stop him, right? They would be like, hey, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just going to go burn my son, right? You know, they would have stepped in, right? So Abraham took the firewood of the whole burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. Then he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. So the fire in his hand means it's like a torch, right? I mean, it'd be cool, really cool if he had like just fire in his hand, but it's a torch, right? And the wood, right? He takes the things he needs. Verse 7, then Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the firewood, but where is the sheep for a whole burnt offering? So Isaac is starting to piece this together. Right? Like, this could be a bad situation. Verse 8, and Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the sheep for a whole burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Verse 9, they came to the place where God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the firewood in order. And he bound Isaac his son hand and foot and laid him on the altar upon the firewood. Okay. So they get up there, ties up Isaac, puts him on the wood, is getting ready to kill him, and then burn him. Now there's an important thing here, or there's an important thing that isn't here that we need to notice, because it's very important going through the rest of the Old Testament and the rest of Jewish religious history, especially leading up to Christ. And that's that we had Isaac ask that one question when they first set off. But notice here, Isaac doesn't say anything. We don't read about Isaac kicking and screaming. Right? What are you doing, Dad? Like, right, as we might expect. Right? Fighting Abraham. Right? From what we read here, Isaac is completely silent and completely compliant. Right. Why is this so important? Well, this is going to get meditated on throughout the rest of the Old Testament. When you read sources like Jewish prayers and things from before the birth of Christ, but in the post-exilic period, so like in the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd centuries BC, especially, there's a whole series of prayers, for example, that are all based around the person of Isaac right here in this verse, and that connect the person of Isaac here in this verse to a whole lot of prophecies in Isaiah and in other prophets that we're really familiar with, but that we don't think of as being associated with Isaac. Like, he was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a spotless lamb he did not open his mouth. Right? And like what we call the servant songs in Isaiah. Right? We see all of those as very clearly pointing to Christ, which they do, right? But before Jesus came and fulfilled these things, right, the Jewish people of the time, who hadn't experienced Christ yet, as we see in the Gospels, misunderstood him when he did come, right? But they were attaching this to Isaac. But not just Isaac. It wasn't just, let's have some meditations on the historical Isaac, right? Or, right? Imagine how Isaac felt when this happened, right? Put yourself in his position, right? But they saw that they connected this through Isaac. So remember, Isaac is the one through whom the seed, last chapter, capital S, is going to come. So this was Isaac as image of the Messiah. Right? And Isaac's silence is taken to be him willingly offering himself. So there was a theological idea before the New Testament, before the birth of Christ, that the Messiah was going to lay down his life in a sacrificial way. And that Isaac was the exemplar of this. Right? That brings, and then Christ comes into that space. And that's why the New Testament writers have that space ready, right, for Christ. Say, oh, now it all comes together. Now we see it. Right? So that idea was already there. Right? So we often, when we read this story, focus on the obedience of Abraham, the heroic obedience of Abraham in being willing to offer his son. But there's also here, from the perspective of the early interpreters, and the church fathers pick up on this too, from the perspective of these early interpreters, there's also this heroic obedience of Isaac. If this is God's will, that I be sacrificed to him, right, so be it. Right? Now the other piece is, oh yeah.
So would the leadership at Jesus' time have known this? Would they have meditated on
They would have been familiar with those traditions, yeah. Because a number of those prayers I mentioned, there's a stupidly, I wish I knew a way to bootleg it. Oh no, this is on the internet. There's a stupidly expensive academic book on those prayers called Prayers Alleged to be Jewish, right? Because those prayers about Isaac are so spot on that a lot of scholars were trying to argue that they were Christian. They're like, no, these have to be later Christian prayers. There's no way these could be Jewish because they're so on the button, right? But yes, those prayers were associated with temple worship because traditionally the place where the temple was built was on Mount Moriah where this happened. So, yes, sir.
So, the testing, the purification of Abraham. Okay, so what was being purified here?
Yeah, that's where I'm about to go.
Oh, okay.
So that's good, you're tracking with me. So, oh yeah.
I was just going to ask, doesn't verse 6 in chapter 22 also point to Christ, where Isaac carried the firewood
Yeah,
his back.
it's laid on his back. Yeah,
Like
yeah,
Christ carrying his cross.
right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's Isaac's perspective, right? What's Abraham doing? Well, we get a clue from St. Paul's epistle to the Hebrews, at least how St. Paul saw this, right? Where he says that Abraham did this knowing of the resurrection. And there's a surface level that's not wrong, where we say, oh, St. Paul is saying that he figured, well, if I kill Isaac, God will bring him back to life, right? It's not wrong, right? But that's just surface level, because the resurrection, right, the anastasis, right, is connected to what I was talking about earlier with the Last Judgment, sort of the restoration of all things, right? Everything being put back in order. Abraham has just been told in the last chapter, right, Isaac, this kid, this is the one who the seed's coming from. All those promises, the promises about becoming like the stars of heaven, all of that is coming through him, right? All of that's coming through him. So what Abraham is being called upon to do here is trust that what God said to him is true in this radical fashion. So it's not just, well, although it's true, yes, God could, even if Isaac was burnt up completely, God could make him alive again. But that Abraham is looking to the truth of all of the promises given to him, all of which are summed up in Isaac, right? And to trust God in light of that and therefore be willing to do this thing, right? Now, why does this especially apply to Abraham? What's the place he fell down twice? Trusting God.
That you will have a son. The promise.
Yeah, yeah, and trusting God that when he goes into Egypt, when he meets Abimelech, that God's not going to let him be murdered so that they can take his wife, right? And trying to protect himself instead of protect his wife, right? And this self-interest, which, if you look at it, it's not just trusting God to take care of you, right? Because we could take that to a silly level, right? I hate to be the one to break it to you, but we can't trust God that he will never let anything bad happen to us. Bad things happen to us, right? That's not what trusting God means, right? But in Abraham's case, God has promised all of these things to him, and he thinks, nah, I'm going to walk into Egypt and they're going to murder me. That's not just God's not going to take care of me. That's God, all that stuff God said to me, is subject to instant revision if somebody decides to kill me, right? And so this is an important test in the sense we talked about, because Abraham is being called upon not just to sort of passively trust that those promises are true, and that he doesn't have to worry about getting murdered, right? Or, trampled by a camel, right? But that he's going to take this positive action, right? I'm calling on you to do something that would, from your perspective, make sure that I can't keep those promises. Do you trust enough that I will keep those promises that you'll do it? Right? Because before, with Hagar, you didn't even trust me that I could get Sarah pregnant. Well, restoring the kid who you just burned up completely, you just cremated, is a lot trickier than that, right? Right? So that's what he's called upon to do. So this is the extreme example. You failed repeatedly at this, right? At much less extreme versions. Now we're going to go through, right? Here's the final, right? The final test, the final boot camp, right? And not only that, but remember this testing, right? You're going to be like one of the stars of heaven. You're going to become like God, right? Like God, the God who he's talking to, right? Part of that for Isaac is being willing to be obedient even to the point of death. That sounds a lot like God, right? That sounds a lot like Christ. Right? And Abraham's being called upon to watch his son die. That's a lot like God. Right? And this trial isn't just producing knowledge about, right? Oh, you learned some facts about God, right? You have some better systematic theology. You can now list all the divine attributes, right? This is firsthand experiential. This is real knowledge. This is what, when we're talking about someone having a relationship with God, this is what that means. It's experiential knowing of Him, right? At this deep level, sharing this experience with Him. Yeah?
You know, it seems, you explain it this way, it seems so critical in the entire history, right, leading up to Christ, that you wonder, I mean, this is speculation, right, but you wonder if this event didn't happen, it's almost like a center point, you know, that makes the crucifixion, when it happened, comprehensible.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the central narrative of the crucifixion, right? And if it hadn't been there, or if Abraham would have failed, the history would have been something completely different.
Right, right. Now, of course, God knew Abraham, and so knew he wouldn't, right? But yes, this is, like I was saying in the other thing, the Old Testament isn't just, here's a bunch of stuff that happened in the ancient world, right? It's setting this frame.
Yeah, I mean, it's
So that when Christ comes, you could theoretically recognize
like
him.
the center of the
Yeah.
frame, and then Christ fulfills the prophecy.
Right.
But when you mention like Isaiah, I've never seen this before, but since you elucidated it, yeah, this is the central motif, right? It makes it all comprehensible. And the wood of the cross. Now, when I hear the wood of the cross, because you hear that all the time during Holy Week, the wood of the cross. It's you got to go back to Isaac and the wood.
Yeah.
Just like when you hear, behold the Lamb of God, you've got to go back to Exodus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and this is why the church has us read Genesis during Lent and the beginning of Exodus during Holy Week.
It's
yeah.
incredibly beautiful.
So that when we get to Holy Week, we have all this ready
Yeah.
to see what's going on. Yeah. So do the daily readings, everybody, during Lent and Holy Week. Yes, sir.
When they contemplate Isaac and Israel and Abraham and Israel, they contemplate that Abraham is the killer of Isaac. I mean, I know he doesn't actually kill him. Therefore, the crucifixion makes me think that, it's
right.
the Israelites that are
Right.
elevating force between Christ.
So this is an important thing to reiterate. Sacrifice is not about killing. I know we've been taught that. All right. But, so for example, a lot of the sin offerings in the Torah are wheat cakes. I mean, technically you're killing the wheat, I guess, in a very technical sense, right? But, right? And there's drink offerings, there's grain offerings. Sacrifices don't always involve killing anything. They pretty much always involve food. But what sacrifices are hospitality. Right? They're offerings of hospitality. The most common form of hospitality is a meal, sharing food. Right? And so this is why, even with the animal sacrifices, when you read Leviticus and read about the animal sacrifices, right, they go into this painstaking detail about butchering the meat and what pieces you offer to God and what pieces the priest eats and what pieces the people eat. And there's no instructions about how to kill the animal. Zero. That's not even part of the ritual, killing the animal. So you have to kill it to eat it, right? You're not going to eat it alive, right? So that's a necessary precursor, right? But there's a portion that's given, and a whole burnt offering, you're offering the whole thing to God. Yeah.
So it's imploring God, because it's eating, it's imploring God for the restoration of communion.
Right.
That's what
The restoration and the maintenance of communion, yes.
So-
The same way we do with each other.
Around the table.
Right. We gather around the table. This goes straight into the Eucharist. This is why the Eucharist is a sacrifice. We're not killing Christ again.
Right, right. So,
Right.
so it's really, it's the acknowledgement, tell me if this is right. It's the acknowledgement of the sinner that the communion is broken, so he offers something as the indication he desires the communion restored, and because God is merciful, it is restored. Is that
Yes.
it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's why, like St. John of Damascus, in the replacement for the cherubic hymn on Holy Saturday, Christ comes to offer himself as food to the people. What-
He offers himself to the Father.
Yes, and he offers himself as food to the people. So that's even taking this sacrificial perspective of Christ's death. Why does Christ have to die? Kind of literally, St. John is saying so we can eat him. In the John 6 sense.
We can
In the John 6 sense,
partake.
right? That he's the bread from heaven.
Yeah.
So man, before the fall, before Adam and Eve's fall, they were already in perfect communion.
Right,
There wasn't this need, there wasn't this
right,
kind of approach.
right. But that's how humans have always done that too, right? We get together, we have a meal, right? And if you and I have had some kind of problem, we might sit down and have lunch and talk it out, right? And so that's, and then maintaining that over time. That's why meat offered to idols becomes such a big deal for St. Paul, like in Corinth. Because all the meat in the meat market was from the pagan sacrifices. And so they're like, well, wait, if I eat that, am I participating in the pagan sacrifice? And St. Paul says, kind of, yeah. So don't. Right. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I asked my question, because you were talking about
Yeah.
prayers that anticipate the Messiah
Right.
in self-sacrifice.
Right.
And seeing Isaac as the embodiment of that precursor, I guess,
Right.
self-sacrifice. Abraham's seen as God watching his son being sacrificed.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's an aspect of the story where Abraham is also,
Yeah.
by his hand, Isaac is dying. And when the Messiah comes, by his descendants, they're the ones motivating the destruction of the Messiah.
Right.
So was there some sense of that
Well,
contemplation of the story where they anticipate, well, we might be the ones
So
by whose hand?
St. Matthew's gospel does something interesting with that. And it became an unfortunate reality, especially in the West, but in the East too, we have to own up to it, that there was a lot of sort of blaming ethnic Jews for having killed Jesus, in terms of guilt, right? I know you're not trying to, but that's not where St. Matthew's gospel goes with it, right? So the most infamous line in St. Matthew's gospel that got Mel Gibson a bunch of heat was when the people say, let his blood be on us and on our children. And we all read this as, that's talking about guilt. That's talking about blood guilt. They're accepting guilt. It's not at all what it's talking about. It's talking about sacrificial blood. Now, that's not what they meant when they said it. But St. Matthew's saying, this happens a lot in the Gospels, right? Someone will say more than they know. Like the high priest saying, it's better for one man to die for the sake of the people than for the Romans to come kill us all. And it's sort of like, well, he just meant, we should kill Jesus so the Romans don't come after us. But one man dying for the sake of the people meant more than he knew, right? So those people meant it out of hate, surely at the time. But St. Matthew's doing something interesting that kind of got turned on its head, right? That Christ ended up turning their murder into a sacrifice. So, and that's not necessarily an element here, right?
So that means then, when you say sacrificial blood, they're saying it as, okay, we'll impute the guilt. They mean impute the guilt onto us. They mean that.
They as people were probably meaning that.
They're saying that.
Yes.
But
St. Matthew is saying that gets kind of inverted by God, that Christ's blood is the blood that speaks a better word than that of Abel. And then actually his blood purifies them,
Yeah,
right, and restores the covenant, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Father, in terms of making the sacrifice, imploring God to restore communion, is there in the sacrificial tradition in Jewish worship, was there a meaningful kind of cue that God had accepted the sacrifice? Or did they attach any?
Yeah, so they didn't. That actually kind of became a problem in Israel later, right? So the way pagans did it was they had a particular class of priests called a haruspex, and his job was to read the entrails of the animal. And we have all of these ancient clay models. They actually make like little kidneys and little livers with little like cuneiform writing on them, marking like, here's what to look for in this lobe of the liver, and here's what to look for, here's the signs, right? And so when they were butchering the animal, this priest would be invited over to come and take a look and sort of read the omens. And there were certain bad omens that meant that the god or gods had rejected, right, the sacrifice. So that's sort of how they did it. And there were these weird cases where, like, at one point they went to sacrifice a calf and it didn't have a heart when they went in. So that was like, oh, we're doomed, right? Like, this is this is bad, right? But so obviously that was forbidden to Israel, right? God said, no, none of that, right? So the way it's set up, like in the Torah, is that whether or not God accepts it is not based on the way it was with the pagan gods. Did I perform the ritual correctly? It was based on the heart and soul and spirit of the person doing the offering. This is part of what's being gotten at in Cain and Abel, right? So it was about that in terms of whether it was effective, right? So you get, like in Numbers, don't offer sacrifices for the high-handed sinner, meaning the sinner who's not repentant, right? Because God's saying, if he's not repentant, I'm not going to, right? Like, he's not going to receive forgiveness, even if you kill every bull in the world and, burn all the meat, right? That's not how it works. And so then that reaches this crisis point late in Israel and Judah's history, where God has the prophets come and say, look, just stop doing sacrifices, because none of you are repentant. You're all continuing in your wickedness. Your sacrifices, therefore, are abominations, right? It's like if you kept continuously abusing someone and then inviting them over for dinner and making nice, and then doing it again the next day, right? Like, eventually that person's going to say, yeah, I don't want to eat with you anymore, right? Like, there's no communion here, right? There's no, right? The repentance, that's it. So it was a little different in Israel in that way, right? So whether or not it was accepted was based on, right? And we see this in Psalm 50 also, right? Because David says, right, you don't want the bulls and goats. Sacrifice to God is a broken spirit, a contrite and humble heart you will not despise. And he doesn't say, therefore we don't need to do sacrifices. He says, you do that first, then I will offer bullocks on your altar, right? Because it's when it's accompanied by that, then God will accept the sacrifice. Right? Okay. So we're about out of time, but I can't leave off here.
Let's keep going.
Right? So Isaac's about to die. Tune in next week. So verse 8, Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven. So we see the same pattern again, right? Calls to him from heaven and says, Abraham, Abraham. And he says, here I am, right? Probably more eagerly this time. Oh, good. He then replied, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know you fear God, since for my sake you have not spared your beloved son. Okay? So this is not now I know. I didn't know before, right? Right. But so the word for know here in Hebrew, yada, is the word that's used, for example, Adam knew his wife Eve and they had a son. Right? So this is not knowledge about. This is, now I know a new fact about Abraham. Right? This is actual knowledge like knowing someone, right? There are people, like my wife's doctor, who probably know more facts about her than I do. I don't know all her cholesterol levels, right? I don't know all these detailed facts. But I know my wife in a way that her doctor doesn't. If not, he's in trouble. No. She has a female doctor, I think I'm saying. But that's a different thing, right? Knowing about someone and knowing someone is a completely different thing, right? So that's the kind of knowledge, right? And the way it is literally the Hebrew is, now I know Abraham that he fears God. Right? That he fears God. Right. That this kind of knowledge of God, the kind of knowledge of God that's being talked about here is the knowledge of God from a person, a human person, and God having gone through something like life together. In the same way that the knowledge I have of my wife and that she has of me is from us going through life together. Right. So that's the kind of knowledge here we're talking about. Verse 13, then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him a ram caught in a thicket by its thorns. So he brought it for a whole burnt offering in the place of his son. Okay. Now, some folks, I'll try to make this quick, will try to jump in here and be like, aha, look, substitutionary atonement. Look, God provides a substitute. What's the problem with that? That assumes God still wants Isaac to die, right? Like, I need Isaac to die. Okay, I'll take the ram. He's just said he doesn't want. Right? And notice in the instructions, he doesn't say, I don't want Isaac to die, so hey, go get that ram over there, because I got to get some blood somewhere. Right? Blood for the blood god or something. Right? What is this offering? This offering is a thank offering. Right? He's now going to have this meal with God. Right? To celebrate now what has happened, having come through this experience. Right?
So that was so powerful. I was taught it was a substitute.
Yeah. I know, because I know some of the people who taught you. Yeah.
There's no substitution at all. If it's a thank offering, the test is over.
Yeah.
What needed to be accomplished was accomplished. It's not really about Isaac dying. It's about Abraham being tested.
Yes.
Okay? And it has nothing to do with that. That just forms the test. It's all about Abraham. It's not about Isaac.
Yeah. Although Isaac has this
As an
other,
in the drama. So the ram is really an offering of thanksgiving.
Having come through it.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal.
For some reason, I can't. The symbolic meaning of a horn on an animal is its power.
Yeah.
And then the fact that it's caught in a thorn bush is getting me to the parable of, some getting the thorns, some getting the good earth. So it was very fascinating that the thank offering also has the power of this creature was caught in the thorn bush, which then he was able to just, instead of trusting in his own power to make it happen, it kind of was presented, and no care of the earthly things, but that heavenly seeing, like the resurrection.
Right.
He's like, oh, now I can just believe his hearing.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't.
And interestingly, remember when Abraham said to Isaac, when Isaac said, hey, where's the sacrifice?
Yeah.
He said, God will provide one.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But also, Isaac yet once again prefigures Christ in the resurrection, because Abraham
Receives him back from the dead. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. In that sense. Yeah.
I'm wondering, given that the ram was found caught in a thorn bush, is there any commentary from the fathers about that prefiguring the crown of thorns?
I'd have to look. I would imagine probably. In fact, I would think pretty definitely.
And Isaac imaging Christ, specifically Christ in the Eucharist, as like a bloodless sacrifice. I don't know if is that in there?
Well, the idea there is that we're not, of the unbloody sacrifices, we're not killing Christ again. Right? Yeah. Yeah.
So would they have a whole burnt offering for that lamb, or would it have been a sharing of them?
We're not told. Yeah, we're not told.
It says, he says that. So
Yeah, it's a whole burnt offering?
he-
Yeah, for a whole burnt.
so he
Okay, yeah,
brought
so it was a whole burnt
in the
offering.
place of
Right,
his
but
son.
that's saying to, that's like if you had a visitor come to your house and you said, right, and you just gave him food to eat. Right? Like, is the idea, right? Right. Thus Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord has appeared, as it is said to this day, in the mountain the Lord was seen. Right? Notice there, it didn't say here that the angel of the Lord actually appeared. It said the voice from heaven. So how has Abraham seen the Lord? Through this experience. Right? Through his experience. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you did this thing, and for my sake did not spare your beloved son, I will certainly bless you and assuredly multiply your seed as the stars of heaven and as the sand on the seashore, and your seed shall inherit the cities of their enemies." Okay? So he reiterates the promises, right? And the way it's translated is very easy to read this. Oh, because you did this, now I'm going to do. He already gave him these promises, right? So the key is that you don't get this from the punctuation, right? Because you did this, certainly, for certain, for sure I will bless you. That's not God saying, well, I was iffy about it before, but now for sure, right? The certainty is Abraham's, right? The certainty of the promises is Abraham's, having gone through this experience, right?
Not following that.
It's Abraham who's certain that it'll happen.
Right. It's not that God is now certain he's going to follow through on his promises.
Right.
Because remember, the whole part of this is Abraham learning to trust in these promises, that they're going to happen.
Right.
Right? And so it's saying now Abraham can be certain that this is going to come to pass.
He believes it.
Not just trust or believe, but it's for sure, for Abraham.
That would really be the fruit of the testing.
Right. Because of the experience, there's no doubt
Yes.
now. So we're not going to have these things like Abimelech again. We're not going to have these things like Pharaoh again. We're not going to have these things like Hagar and Ishmael again. Yeah.
You thought the whole Pharaoh thing would have been the first time, the only time.
Yeah.
You know, and then because of that situation.
But yeah. Yeah. Now, having gone through this with God, now we're there, right? Verse 18, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, right? In that singular seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, not just the ones descended from you, right? All of them too, but not just them. Shall be blessed because you obeyed my voice. Verse 19, so Abraham returned to his servants, and they rose and went together to the well of oath, and Abraham dwelt at the well of oath. So he goes back to where he was camping. We're not at the end of the chapter, but we've run over time. So we'll wrap it up there for this time.
Oh, Stephen,
And-
this Bible study's been incredible, but really all of the Bible studies have been incredible, and there's 33 others that you can watch. And there's more.
Did you
coming.
monetize them somehow? Like what? Oh, okay.
Not yet. If
Okay.
so, we're going to give that to the diocese.
Okay.
Is it all just Genesis?
It's the story of King David, the prophet and King David first. We actually have a complete series that Father Stephen DeYoung led. The idea is to take men, prominent men from Scripture, and to study that as men, and we're continuing. So we actually have a full series on the prophet and King David's life from the perspective of what we can learn as men from that story and the whole arc of his life. And when we finished that, we started the story of Abraham, which is what we're currently going through, and God willing, and Father Stephen willing, after, we'll pick another man from...
Moses is next.
Ooh, there's a little bit of
Yeah.
That's a little teaser. But, I know we're over time. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much. But can we all please recognize Father Stephen? We have Vespers coming up, right? I think
Yeah.
it's 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming. We'll see you at Vespers.
Thank you, Father Steve.
No, pleasure.
Good to kill this, Michael. I good to kill this.
Yes.
All right, I was wondering, is a bow shot distance away a common expression, or is that prefiguring him becoming an archer, Ishmael?
I think it's both.
Okay.
That was a distance that someone could, right, but you could have said a bunch of things. You could have said a stone's throw, you could have said, so why use a bow shot? Well, because he's going to be an archer.
People have been reading that, knowing it, like, aha.
Yeah, so there's a wordplay there, and also, yeah.
I'm sorry, I messed you up.
No,
I
yes.
asked my question very well.
Okay.
When you were saying that as the Jews contemplated, as the Israelites contemplated this story, they realized that the Messiah would
Yeah.
be self-sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
In the story in Genesis, the sacrifice comes from within the group. Abraham even leaves behind his two young men. It's just Abraham and Isaac there. Abraham's the one that takes something out. So I was wondering, in contemplating the story, did they realize this sacrifice would be something that we call?
Right, yeah. And the answer is not really.
Not really, okay.
Yeah, that they were more focused
You'd
on
have to be
Isaac's silence,
Yeah.
presenting it as a kind of self-sacrifice. So they weren't looking at it in those meditations as Abraham sacrificing Isaac, but they were focusing on the element of, I mean, that's there obviously, but they're looking at it from the perspective of Isaac willingly offering himself.
I get that. Okay.